Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, we're going to be talking all about the Cold War. The Cold War is probably the best historical example of a conflict that is almost entirely ideological. It was basically communism versus capitalism. So, the Cold War, the start of the Cold War, is all linked to the end of World War II. There was a couple of different conferences that happened after World War II, where the big three, and the big three are the prime ministers or presidents of the three biggest economies in the world. And that was that of the USSRs, which was Joseph Stalin, the US, which was FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and in the United Kingdom, it was Winston Churchill. So the first big conference was Yalta. And in Yalta, it was decided that Germany would be divided into four zones of occupation: one zone to the British, one to the American, one to the French, and one to the Soviet. And it also set the boundaries or borders of Poland. The three leaders seem to agree on the terms, and though there's mistrust between the East and the West, there's some optimism coming out of Yalta. Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill kind of got along relatively well compared to future US presidents, for example. And these four zones of occupation was basically decided that if each of us kind of take a region to look after, then there's less chance that Germany will revolt again and bring us into a World War III. Moving on, a couple months later was Potsdam, and FDR was replaced by Harry Truman. And Harry Truman was very anti communist. And this kind of escalated the tensions between Stalin and the Allies. Um, so, as well as Harry Truman replacing FDR, Clement Attlee replaced Churchill. It now became apparent that there was two superpowers in the world: the USA and the USSR. An air of mistrust between Stalin and the Western powers had developed. In this conference, it was decided that Germany would pay reparations and Nazi war criminals would be tried and punished. And also decided that Soviet troops would occupy Korea north of the 38th parallel in what would become North Korea. So here's a picture of the big three. You'll see them a lot in cartoons and editorial stuff. Social studies diplomas love to use cartoons, caricatures, all of those pieces. You'll often see Stalin with a big nose, big hat, color red associated with him and communism. FDR is very old in this picture. Um, but when they'll usually use images of him when he's younger. And Churchill is the short, fat one with a cigar, always. So those kind of pinpoint pieces um, are how you're going to be able to recognize these three. So the Iron Curtain. So the mood of this Potsdam Yalta meetings led Churchill to deliver a speech about the Iron Curtain. He kind of used that as a metaphor to describe the line in Europe between self-governing democratic countries of the West and countries in Eastern Europe that were under Soviet control. This kind of is the beginning. The Iron Curtain is the beginning of the Cold War, and it shaped the world for the next 50 years. The Cold War, like I said, was an ideological war between capitalism and communism. Instead of entering into like a military or hot war, the US and USSR confronted each other indirectly through propaganda, the arms race, the quest for prestige. There was fighting, so proxy wars also took place, but there was never a war between USA and USSR. They never declared war on each other. They were never fighting each other directly. It was always indirectly. And then both superpowers sought to protect and expand their sphere of influence. The Cuban Missile Crisis was probably the closest or the brink of the Cold War becoming a direct nuclear conflict between these superpowers. So here's a picture that can kind of show you that Iron Curtain, right? You don't see pink on this side and you don't really see green on this side. There is a clear border that describes countries ideologically. On the left, you have mostly democratic countries, mostly capitalist countries. And on the right, you have all of the Soviet controlled or Soviet allies that were heavily focused on socialism and communism. Here is a cartoon about the Iron Curtain. As you would have learned in Social 20 about the League of Nations and the United Nations and their struggle to really diffuse the Cold War, a lot of cartoons try to poke fun at the lack of ability of the League of Nations and the United Nations to kind of evade conflict, whether it be through a hot war or a Cold War. So containment. Both USSR and USA really tried to contain the spread of communism or contain the spread of capitalism. Really, what they wanted is they wanted their base, right? Their sphere of influence to stay communist or to stay capitalist. And each of them kind of, well, both of them provided plans to kind of put this containment in action. And so the United States used the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan as political and economic policies of containment. The opposite, so the USSR used its own program, Comecon, and the Molotov Plan. And it was the same, a political plan of containment and an economic plan of containment. Okay. Truman Doctrine was basically that political policy of the US to try to stop the spread of communism from expanding to Western Europe. It's based on the domino theory. If you let one domino fall, it sets off a chain reaction. So, under the Truman Doctrine, you're basically saying if we let one country turn communist, then other countries will follow. It will be like a domino effect. We can't let that happen. Same with Comecon. Okay, the USSR said we cannot let any of the states in our sphere of influence take on any practices of capitalism. So we need to contain it so we don't have that domino effect. Marshall Plan, like the Truman Doctrine, was containment. Marshall Plan focused on economics, and it basically provided economic aid to any European country to rebuild after World War II, provided they remain under the U.S. sphere of influence. The countries that this program benefited the most were Greece and Turkey. Both of these were in 1947. So one thing that you'll learn as you study or read into foreign economic policy is very rarely will you see money given to countries without serious strings attached. The Marshall Plan, the string attached was that you would stay capitalist and you would stay connected to the United States. The Molotov Plan gave money to countries as long as they stayed in good books with the Soviets and stayed under communism. Just like political and economic pacts, we also had military pacts. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was to stop the spread of communism. And it was created on April 4th, 1949. And basically, NATO is a military alliance. If one of the NATO members gets attacked, then the rest will step in um, and come to their aid. So, Canada, the United States, a bunch of European countries are all part of NATO. And basically, if anyone ever invaded Canada, then all of the NATO members would step in and help fight whoever that is. And NATO's come to light recently in the news because Ukraine, a former Soviet state, really wanted to join NATO, and that increased tensions between Ukraine and Russia, which led to Russia invading Ukraine. So, on the flip side, NATO is part of the US sphere, and the USSR had their own military pact, and that was called the Warsaw Pact. So, here you can kind of see two pictures. Here's NATO, you can see Canada right there, and the US right there, and then the Warsaw Pact as well. So Berlin, Berlin was the center of kind of the Cold War conflict for quite some time, and it all kind of started with the Berlin blockade. So at the end of World War II, Germany was divided into four occupation zones, as I had mentioned before, but it was generally ran by the US and the USSR. The US took those three occupation zones and the USSR kept theirs. Berlin, the capital city, was also divided in half. The problem with this is that Berlin was located deep within East Germany, which is Soviet territory. So, in order to reach Berlin, it was necessary to cross the Soviet controlled areas. This led Berlin to be the kind of temperature gauge of the Cold War. If tensions were high in Berlin, you knew that tensions were high in terms of the Cold War. On June 24th, 1948, the first kerfuffle of the Cold War occurred when the USSR attempted to starve the US out of Berlin by cutting off all land access to the city. And this was known as the Berlin Airlift. So the Western response was to fly in supplies over an 11-month period to West Berlin. And this was done by the British, French, and Americans. Stalin finally lifted the blockade about a year later. And a couple years later, not a couple years, about 11 years later, the Berlin Wall was erected to stop people from leaving East Berlin for West Berlin. So here you can see um, East Berlin and West Berlin, and all of West Berlin was walled in. And basically, what was happening is the Soviets weren't able to really control the influx of people from East Berlin escaping Soviet control into West Berlin. So the solution was to erect a wall. So, along with everything that was happening in Berlin, there was also an arms race. So, the arms race is kind of classified by the desire to have the best and the most nuclear weapons. So, if you know your history of World War II well, the end of World War II um, is often associated with the dropping of the first and only nuclear or atomic bomb on a group of people. That was in Japan, and that stopped World War II. From 1945 to 1949, the U.S. had nuclear weapons, and then in 1949, the USSR exploded its first atomic bomb in a test. So, because both of these superpowers had atomic weapons, each country sought to build its stockpile and develop more effective weapons and delivery systems. It's kind of known as peace through the balance of power. Each side had sufficient nuclear weapons to destroy each other, and each side developed warning systems that could detect a nuclear attack with enough time to launch a retaliatory strike. The biggest reason that there was never any fighting in the Cold War was because of mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. And basically, what that means is I am not going to go to war with you if I know that both of us are going to lose. And that is what happened through the Cold War. I am not going the US is not going to go to war with the USSR because if they did, they both would lose. In all reality, the whole world would lose because so much nuclear weapons would destroy our whole global environment. And so that's kind of argued as to why we've never had a World War III. Um, because if all of the superpowers got involved in a world war, there would more than likely be the use of nuclear weapons. And with that, with the fallout of that, um, no one would win that war. So here you can see the increase of nuclear weapons, starting off in 1945 when there was just one, and moving up to the late 80s, 90s, where there was tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. And you can see that today there's a lot less than there was in the late 90s. And that's primarily because a lot of talks and a lot of views on terms of it's kind of unnecessary to have this many weapons stockpiled. So, brinkmanship, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, the closest the Cold War ever got to a hot war was the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Fidel Castro, who was the leader that led a communist takeover over Cuba, and became the communist leader there. Um, let's kind of reset here. Okay, the U.S. attempted to stop this by attempting to invade Cuba and assassinate him. This was called the Bay of Pigs, but this was a failure. The U.S. Really saw Cuba as a extreme threat to their safety and security from communism because Cuba is very, very close to the United States. Um, it's within miles, like it's not within miles, but let's say within 200 miles of the tip of Miami. So, because of Fidel Castro's ties to communism, it leads Cuba to go under the sphere of influence of the USSR. And the US kind of pushes Cuba away from them when they attempt to invade and assassinate Fidel Castro. So in 1962, the Soviet Union, who was led under Nikita Khrushchev, attempted to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. These missiles would have been within striking distance of most US cities. The US president under John F. Kennedy felt it could not allow this threat. And the Soviet Union wanted to put missiles in Cuba because the US had missiles in Turkey. Turkey shares a border with the USSR at this time. So the United States' response was to quarantine all of Cuba. So all ships destined for Cuba would be stopped and searched for nuclear weapons by the US Navy. This quarantine was essentially a blockade, and boarding a foreign ship on the open sea was considered an act of war, but the US felt that they had no other options. Cuban Missile Crisis was very close, right? You basically had ships from the USSR coming across the Atlantic and the US having ships to try to stop them. And if they ever met, there would have been a war. But again, mutually assured destruction really kind of stopped this brinkmanship from happening. To remember brinkmanship, think about like if you're ever on the brink of something. Okay. So let's say I'm at the brink of jumping into the river. It means I just about jumped into the river. I didn't jump into the river, but I almost did. So brinkmanship is talking about those moments where something is almost happening. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is almost when the Cold War became a hot war. So both superpowers put their nuclear forces on the highest state of alert, and the world was on the brink of a nuclear war. The USSR blinked. The Soviet Union ordered its ships to turn around and dismantled nuclear sites in Cuba. Because of this, the US also withdrew its missiles from Turkey. So after this, after getting almost to the brink of war, there was a period of détente, right? And détente, it means that things cooled down, things relaxed. So détente is a French word and means a relaxation of tensions. So the U.S. and the USSR kind of peacefully coexist without a lot of things happening during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis to the end of the 70s. And at this time, a hotline was established between the Kremlin and the White House. The Kremlin is the government building in the Soviet Union, and the White House, of course, is where the president resides in the US. Um, if you've ever watched a movie where the president has like a red phone and they pick up the red phone and they call the Soviet Union, that kind of is uh, paying homage to this hotline. Also, in 63, 69, there are two treaties to kind of stop or limit the amount of nuclear testing that is happening in both the Soviet Union and the USA. And basically, this is because land, air, and water, as well as outer space, are being affected environmentally by the impact of this nuclear fallout from these weapons. It also happened in 82 with the START Treaty. So there was lots of talking that happened between the Soviet Union and US. Okay, at this time it was Nixon, at this time it was Reagan. So the Iron Curtain is starting to break. In Hungary, a revolution happened in 1956. The Hungarian people revolted against the Soviet government after the de Stalinization by Khrushchev. In 2 weeks, they formed a new government and started moving towards a democratic state. The Soviets invaded and re established control to show the world two things. The Soviets would not lose control, they would contain Eastern Europe, and the Americans would not intervene in the Soviet sphere of influence. Prague Spring happened in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. A liberal government under Dubek was elected and he granted freedoms to the people and wanted to transform to a democratic state and have good relations in the Western countries. The USSR and Warsaw Pact nations invaded and occupied the countries to reverse reforms. They introduced the Brezhnev Doctrine. It was the USSR's duty to stop any threat to established communist countries. And then in Yugoslavia, Joseph Tito, Yugoslavia was a communist country that was then allied with the Soviet Union. But under the leadership of Joseph Tito, it distanced itself from the Soviet Union and defied both Stalin and the USSR's demands to be loyal only to the Soviet Union. It fostered relationships with the West and became a part of the non aligned movement, countries that would not take sides in the Cold War. Because it did not share a border with the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union felt that it was not worth going to war over. Wars. So proxy wars were basically wars that were fought between two sides, and the U.S. and the USSR stepped in or stepped to the side to kind of help one side or the other. So in Korea, the North Korean invasion of South Korea in June of 1950 forced the UN to take collective action. As a result of a boycott of the Security Council by the USSR, the Council was able to authorize action. The Korean War was marked by a swift northern assault, followed by a UN counteroffensive, which drove the North Korean forces back almost to the Chinese border. Although the war ended in a stalemate when North Korea received massive aid from Communist China, it became the first time that the UN had taken action against an aggressor nation, and was the first time that the US and the USSR fought indirectly. The US on the side of South Korea and the USSR on the side of North. So, Vietnam. The wars in Vietnam were essentially wars of national liberation for the Vietnamese people. The primary communist rebels fought first against the French. The French were kind of colonizing Vietnam at the time. Vietnam was made a French protectorate at the end of World War II. And then again, US controlled Vietnam when the US began a policy of direct military involvement in Vietnam in 1965 to help spread the to prevent the spread of communism. The North Vietnamese found a ready ally in the Soviet Union. Domestic pressures, student protests eventually led to the US withdrawing from Vietnam. And without the support of the US, the South Vietnamese government fell. Vietnamese communists took control of the country. The US policy of containment had failed. Vietnam is a very famous war because no one liked the war in Vietnam. The US was basically fighting within a country that did not want them there, did not want capitalism at that time. A big chunk of the population, anyway. Afghanistan can also kind of be seen as a proxy war. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support a pro Soviet regime. The Soviet forces faced heavy resistance from guerrilla fighters, the Mujahideen, that were equipped by the US. When the US departed in 1984, the Taliban takes power. So, what you'll often hear when it comes to the war in Afghanistan is the US actually provided military weapons to the Taliban. And so lots of people say, oh, the Taliban is awful. Yes, the Taliban has done some awful things. And the US supplied them with weapons, tanks, military items, just so that they could defeat the Soviets. Okay, I have a video here for the Cold War. I'm not going to show it. I'm just going to link it in the Brightspace so that you can have it. There's a lot of information about the Cold War. Um, so take your time with the assignment and also go through this crash course world history video because it does a great job of just outlining kind of everything that I've said as well with some better graphics and some good images. Again, if you have any questions about concepts from chapter 7, please reach out to your teacher. See you guys next chapter.